is that we are not on track, that we are very far away when we think about NDCs and our climate objective. But even worse, we haven't developed or we haven't pushed enough to have countries developing long-term strategies. That we are very far away. If you have an NDC, when we think about having long-term strategy, in our climate objective, that will mean but even worse, or not we haven't develop or don't have a push of what is your end to have countries developing long-term strategy. Work that we are probably will have an NDC when we think about divest into some other element and not go straight but even worse or not we have so we have to continue or don't have a clarity of what is your and remember something I am currently working probably with personal when we think about divest into some other element and not go where we are with even worse or not we have so we how much we have advanced our net zero ecosystem. And when we think I am public side, means NDCs are long-term strategy, in trying to have that as an investment, and not going we are now, or not we do have how much we have advanced, and unfortunately, the things we have I am public side, means we don't know how in trying to have that based on science, that we are announced by countries, are how much we have advanced, and to achieve our own. I don't have a mechanism to validate those how we don't have that based on science that we are announced by countries and how much we have advanced. So it's not just about our own strategy. It's about the mechanism that validate those so that is the second element to connect. Based on science, I am talking that we are announced by countries and how much we have to connect. It's not just about we are first of all, let me say something because also I am with Pablo, and also I am sharing the climate crisis and we know how much we have asking also many about we are moving MBS forward. And so I not only by I also I am sharing the climate but also by now I know how much but we have progress even when we got in February, March of 2022 the UNEA and so I not only that has formalized MPS but all formal and after that but we have progress FTC when we got in February, March of 2022 they have referred so I not only and now we are in a time of June and after that so we have to know when we got in February, March and recognize good MPS practice and how to develop good standards for high-quality MBS intervention. We don't know yet where exactly that process will land. We have to envision to have this landing in something concrete that could help countries to implement MBS as a key tool for address their own climate targets and climate objectives. That is happening in the UNEA process, what it is good. But on the other hand, things are happening on the ground. And there are many good interventions related to MBS, and some others that clearly are not. Yes. an important tool to improve NDCs that it is about. And I remember UNDP some years ago that released a very good document with 7 pathways to include MBS in the NDCs. We have to recover that piece and to see how can we make MBS instrumental countries, mostly in the developing world or the global south, which main source of emission it is related to nature. MBS can be an instrumental mechanism to address that main source of emission in the developing world. And finally, carbon markets, with a caveat. MBS could create markets, but that is not the objective of MBS. That is important to be mentioned because sometimes some organizations are resisting to MBS thinking, no, we are commoditizing nature by developing nature-based solutions because it is to create markets, and that is not correct. That is a mistake. But on the other hand, when we think about carbon market, we are working in high-quality carbon markets in the demand and in the supply side. So that it is about today's session. It is to connect those 4 pieces and do it in a way in which by COP28, we could have something to say and something to contribute to improve through the global stocktake our next cycle of the NDCs. So I'm sure that you will enjoy today's session. Be active, raise your hand, interrupt us, because the idea is to have all of us discussing on how to connect dots, how to integrate, and how to promote convergence. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Manuel. I'd like to invite our panelists up. We have a 2-part panel, and we are going to speak more in depth about the concepts that, that Manuel shared with us, really looking at diving deep on what does ambition mean, linked to outcomes and long-term plans for NDCs, and then really highlighting NBS, nature-based solutions. So first, I'd like to invite Midori Paxton up. She's head of, maybe, I guess, yeah, please over here. I apologize. I'll put you in with James Lomax. Yeah, so Midori Paxton is the head of Ecosystem Service and Biodiversity at the United Nations Development Program. And second, I'd like to invite James Lomax up. Thanks, James. James is with the Sustainable Food Systems and Agricultural Program with the United Nations Environment Program. And then let me start with you two, and then I'll invite our other 3 panelists up who will speak more about specific examples from a country experience. So let's first start with thinking about this connection of dots and raising ambitions in this global stock-taking moment. What does nature-based solutions look like from a food and nature perspective? And so Midori, maybe let me start with you. If you could give us a little bit more concrete examples of how do countries integrate nature-based solutions into their NDC frameworks, and if you have some great examples to share.
Hello, good. No, thank you, Marissa. Yeah, we all know, right, that we are facing the triple planetary crisis, nature, climate, and pollution. So that really means that without bold action on nature, without, profound change in how we value nature, we are not going to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement or Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework or the SDG as a whole, all 17 of them. And if you look at the cause of climate change and nature loss, the current food system and agriculture system is definitely an obvious culprit. So definitely, as this event theme suggests, that's a great major entry point. So we need really the integrated approach, right? So we need to look at nature, climate, and food system as a whole, and really trying to see how we can tackle it really comprehensively. So what we have been doing from UNDP to support countries is, in addition to the report Manuel just mentioned, we produced 56 nature for climate briefings, country-specific briefings, right? to strengthen this NBS within their NDCs as part of our climate promise work. So for each of these briefings, we assessed really potential of climate mitigation adaptation, nature-based, that which NBS can bring. And we also reviewed NBS that are included in other plans like national development plans and NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, and National Adaptation Plan, and so on. And then we suggested also opportunities for improving NBS in different ecosystems, forest, wetland, coastal areas, and grassland, and agriculture, land, and so on. And then we try to articulate, again, very much in that particular country context, the multiple benefit that NBS approach within NDC can bring, whether it's for job creation, poverty alleviation, food and water security, and disaster reductions, and so on and so on. So you know, I think there has been some progress, right? That the 80% of NDCs do have some kind of nature-based solution entry point, whether it's especially around LULUCF and agriculture sector entry points, so which is good. But what is really urgently needed is how we can turn that into actions, actual work, right, in a concrete way, which will also, again, align with very much with the country's NBSAPs and NAPs and other policies and guidelines. So this really integration part is something which UNDP is really pushing in our support for countries because of, you know, this multiple impact and cost effectiveness and so many other benefits we can see.
Thank you, Midori. I appreciate it linking to the issues Manuel has talked about, having definitions of what quality looks like, having lots of examples and best practices to be shared between countries to capture the imagination of what concrete actions look like across countries. And then I think the piece I'm hearing you saying is the integration across many different national plans, whether it's for NBSAPs, for biodiversity, whether it's for climate change plans, whether it's for ag development plans, really thinking about how to cross-cut and integrate and align these things towards a common set of country goals. I'm going to come back to you to talk more about some of the challenges and constraints of what and why we're not getting deeper. You mentioned that 80% or so of countries have NBS mentioned, and you mentioned some ag. It's also a lot of forestry, but there's a lot of missed opportunity and a need to really support countries to strengthen and even go deeper. So I'm going to come back to you, especially on the nature side in a second. I'd like to go to James and really talk about what does that integration of NBS look like in ag? I mean, we know that the agricultural footprint is very high for global GHG emissions, but also on impact of land use change, on water consumption, on nature. How and what are we thinking of a change to business as usual when it comes to the agricultural sector, and what is the role of nature-based solutions?
So just a small question then. Crikey. Huh. Right, so how long have I got? 35 minutes and counting, my goodness. Oh gosh, so the last bit I'm going to go to the last bit you said first. You know, what is it that, how do we change the business as usual? And I think this is one of the reasons why we're stuck in the global MEA space. I think because while the MEAs create targets and they create ambition, I'm not sure they're really rooted in the political economy in which food systems currently exist. So we have a piece of work currently where we're looking at systemic lock-ins. So what are, you know, it's all very well to say the word transformation, my goodness. So, you know, there's incremental stuff that we can do, but transformation is a whole shake it up and do something differently. Now, how can you do that if you have $1 billion industry that have entrenched assets? How can you do that? So you're asking some of the largest players in the world, whether they be countries, governments, or you know, businesses, to basically strand their assets. This isn't going to happen. So we've got to be very, very careful in how we do this. So much as I like the ambition, transformation, I think it's absolutely important and something I've been speaking about for years. You just have to Google it and you'll see. But the tricky thing about creating it is we're not talking about the political economy in which food systems exist, right? So that might be the cheaper food paradigm, the fact that we're constantly wanting cheaper food. That might be the fact that there's market domination that's currently negative, but actually if you turn that around, that could be very positive if we leverage that kind of influence. And then the third point, as I say, this kind of entrenched investment, which is so difficult to talk about when, as I say, billions of dollars are, I mean, you just have to look at the size of slaughterhouses in many countries. The whole reason they operate is because they have to have a certain number of animals going through it to actually break even. So that's the first point. Transformation is very difficult. Now, some really good examples, and I think, Midori, you touched on all the things that I want to say, so I'm not going to touch my notes, all right? But this issue of integration, I think, is important. It's very, very important. We've got to stop thinking about climate on one hand, biodiversity on the other. It just really does not make sense. And the Global Biodiversity Framework, for me, contains that food systems framework for change. So I would urge you all to have a look at it. I think the NDCs are kind of obviously potentially transformative because they're country level determined, right? I mean, it's in the name. And if you look at the Food Systems Summit, of which I was in the Secretariat, the difference about that was that we looked at country level work. So we have national food systems pathways. So that could very much feed into this idea that NDCs are nationally determined, as are the national food systems pathways. So there's a very nice bit of integration there that we really have to jump on. I can't remember what else you asked. Okay. That one you can't remember. I can actually, and I can give you 3 examples from 3 different continents that are around soil health, right? So I think we have to be quite targeted in our interventions. We have to be strategic. So I've got 3 examples from 3 different continents, from Asia, the US, and Africa, and all of them are really based around very much supporting soil health, and the soil health, if we get that right, can mitigate, it can sequester carbon, it can bring, if we don't have biodiversity below the soil, we won't have it above. It's going to increase resilience. All of these things give better livelihoods to farmers, et cetera, et cetera. And these are 3 documented examples that if we as UNEP or the UN system per se can get that into the UN country pathways, the national food systems pathways, the CCAs, et cetera, then I think that's a very practical way where a nature-based solution that is win-win-win as far as I can tell. So focusing on soil and ecosystem health will bring all the rest. Thank you.
Midori, can I come back to you and maybe give an example of constraints, barriers, and potential opportunities to support countries in overcoming them from the UNDP perspective on integrating MBS into nature goals?
Right. Yes. And before that, I guess I just want to touch upon, if you look at what we talk about in the sort of NBSAP community, the, CBD community, to achieve global biodiversity framework, we need the whole of society, whole of government approach. We need a policy coherence, right? But then if you think about it, that can be said for, I'm sure, the climate work too, right? As well as food system. So that's really something we really need to tackle. And that's where if we bring this nature, climate, and agriculture perspective within that work, whichever field we may be working in, that could have, much bigger impact. And of course, we've been supporting over 140 countries in all sorts of NBS actions, not only for climate, because NBS is really for everything, right? And, from, protected area strengthening, biodiversity finance, ecosystem-based mitigation adaptation, to food system, especially the deforestation commodity supply chain work, and mainstreaming biodiversity in land and seascape planning and sector planning and practices. And, if you see here, that you can see also all that it will be really viable NBS for climate as well. And I just wanted to mention also on the transformation and what we can do. I agree, transformation. I think transformation is needed, but within that, there might be transition of different sectors and practices and so on. But what we have recently launched our new nature pledge, UNDP nature pledge for 2030. It's essentially our new strategy on nature. And we are very much focusing on 3 systemic shifts. One is value shift, which is around changing narratives around nature and economy and nature and society, and really causing the massive behavioral change. Again, I'm talking in the context of nature, but I think this can be said to, the climate and other work. And then second shift is economic and finance shift, which is to redirect finance flows, both public and private, from nature negative towards nature positive. And that includes our support to countries to look at, how they can repurpose, for example, agricultural subsidies towards something more nature positive and also people positive, as well as our support for TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which launched its first framework recommendations last night, and I think there will be a session later on here as well. And then third shift, just quickly, is policy and practice shift. Really, in countries, really practicing that into actual change. So yeah, we have climate, nature, food system teams trying to really all work together so that this connection between NDC, NBSAPs, and food system work can be clearly made so that we can, again, we don't have time, right? 2030 is just around the corner, so that we can really have the big impact in a short span of time. Thanks.
Thank you. I two things I just want to pull. I was at I was late. I was up at the Africa Center where Ngozi Ndwele, the WTO Director General, was speaking along with the Kenyan government. And something she said was the hidden money floating around to advance the agenda. She was obviously speaking about the African continent and leadership and the pathway for those 56 countries. But was repurposing agricultural subsidies. She also, of course, mentioned oil and gas subsidies and support that that industry gets, but agriculture has been on the radar of many different organizations and I think global leaders, but the political will has been something that's been really challenging on that one. And then the other point, you mentioned narrative, great quote from Catherine Hayhoe, who's the chief scientist at TNC, who really said, you know, we need to stop talking about planetary boundaries to save the planet. The planet will go on without us and we'll learn to recalibrate, right? It has before for millennia and will continue. Living within planetary boundaries is about saving humanity and saving ourselves and the life that we know for future generations. And so I think the narrative around what is in our self-interest, it's not nature for nature's sake. I think that's a really important one.
The Secretary General said it, you know, without nature, we have nothing. And without nature, we are nothing.
Yeah, and nature will go on without us. Okay, so second panel, or second part of this panel, let me introduce the rest. Please stay up because we're going to have, and then there will be a little intervention, but let me introduce examples we're going to have from countries themselves instead of hearing about support to countries. Let me introduce the first of the second part of our panel, Sabrina Rose is a climate science implementation officer, excuse me, I'm speaking too fast, from the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. And a second, we have Sandra Valenzuela, dear friend and colleague, the Executive Director and CEO of WWF Colombia, and Mariana Panuncio, welcome, the Country Engagement Director for the NDC Partnership. Ladies, welcome. And while they're getting settled, can I just ask, after the audience, after hearing the section we had with James and Midori, how many people feel hopeful that NBS is going to get traction in our NDCs? Can I just see a show of hands on how many people feel that NBS is a thing? Yeah? Good, okay, half the room. No, but it's like a thing that has arrived and like, it's not going to just be a talk. Okay, we're going to see after this panel how you feel about that after. Okay, so, let me just quickly dive in and Sandra, maybe you would like to start and giving us some examples from Colombia and from the experience of WWF and your partners, our partners.
No, thank you very much for the invite and to discuss a little bit how to really implement NBS into the political context and the local context. And Colombia, as we all know, is very vulnerable because of climate change, but also their food systems are part of the drivers of biodiversity loss or health issues and deforestation and so on. So part of the new development plan, and we call the new development plan, is the policy for the next 4 years, and the policy to be really to drive the investments, even not only the public investment, but also the private ones, is really trying to tackle different type of things that goes right to my mind today. Water, and especially considering Colombia as a water country, water is right now is in the main focus for the territorial planning. It is a little bit of ironic that kind of nowadays we are feeling that, but thanks that we have that into the cornerstone of the territorial planning at the national level and especially at the different type of regions. So saying that water as part of the new Montreal agreement, water and food is starting to get really together. And part of, if we start kind of reading the policy, we are kind of linking the different type of kind of guidelines that the government is putting in place. So it's really promoting nature positive production systems, restoration and agribusiness, and really start reducing the and forcing cattle ranching expansion, because one of the drivers. And also is promoting, in terms of this positive economy in nature economies, what we call the differentiation of regions. So each region has their own values, their own biodiversity values, and their own cultural values. So it's really enhancing the production in differentiation in between regions, and not kind of all are the same. And that is starting to bring biodiversity, culture values into the planning, into the ordering and zoning of the country. And as part of one of the pillars of the policy is the right of food. Because of the social inequalities that we have, there are 41% of the country that doesn't have enough food, or the right food, or the right diet. So, and that is really embedded into promoting in the different regions, and with the smallholders, or promoting land tenure rights or use rights, in case we cannot really promote land tenure rights, for promoting agroecology, for food security, for the right of food, and so on and so forth. So there are different elements that the policy, we can start including the nexus between food systems, water, and depletion, and how the economy has to really be developed. And saying that, there is a whole analysis of this new policy that is kind of calling for a multi-sectoral approach to really include biodiversity, food systems, and climate action. That is bringing health department, equity department, of course, environment as the convener, agriculture, transport, and so on and so forth, to really try to integrate the possibility to achieve the NDC targets with a multi-sectoral commitment. And I think is what the first panel was kind of asking for. What we're still missing is there, but it's not there, can be implicit, is finance. So the country is moving towards kind of green finance, but we need to really include how the finance can really drive the whole nexus between food and biodiversity and climate action. So, but we know it's there, but it's not so explicit. So as part of the non-state actors action is to put it explicit as far as we can do it.
Great. Testing. Okay. Thank you all. So thank you to the organizers for having me here. My name is Sabrina Rose, and I manage the CGR initiative on climate resilience. So the CGR is a global research partnership for a food secure future. And our focus really is on food systems. So it's exciting to be here where we are talking about the integration between climate, food, and nature. And just to react, I think on the point of finance specifically, one of the things that we're researching within the CGR initiative on climate resilience is how to better support countries to access the Green Climate Fund finance, and particularly for adaptation. And so we're partnering right now with the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, as well as the governments of Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda to be able to define proposals that really address the concerns related to adaptation in vulnerable regions. That includes nature-based solutions as well, and really providing the support to countries to access that climate finance to support transition or transformation, whichever term you want to use. But one thing I do want to highlight right now is related to the NDCs, and specifically with our work with the government of Kenya, because Kenya has a strong policy framework for climate action. And one of the things that we see reflected in the NDCs is their National Climate Change Action Plan. So right now, Kenya is undergoing updates to the third National Climate Change Action Plan, which will hopefully inform the next NDC in 2025. And so as part of this work, we're now collaborating with the Ministry of Environment to look at a new area of research in terms of the impact of climate on conflict in the agriculture sector and vice versa. And so really looking at those interactions from a social equity perspective, bringing in different communities and vulnerable groups to be able to say that climate action should be more conflict sensitive. It should also consider conflict over natural resources and how to promote peace building as well. So that's just one example of implementation on the ground that we're doing. And then the last thing I want to highlight refers to a previous analysis that we did in the CGR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, where we looked at the NDCs to assess their ambition in terms of soil organic carbon. And as James already mentioned, soil health. So we know that soil organic carbon has an important role in climate adaptation, mitigation, but also nature-based solutions. And I will say that it's positive in that in the first round of NDCs, only 14 countries even mentioned soil organic carbon, but now that number more than doubled to about 36 countries, including some with targets. So we are seeing a greater emphasis on soil, on nature-based solutions, and I think that is positive and giving hope for the next round of NDCs as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for having us today. My name is Mariana Panuncio-Feldman, and I'm Director for Country Engagement for the NDC Partnership. The NDC Partnership, very briefly, is a global coalition of developing and developed country members, as well as international institutions that are working together to drive climate action in line with development goals. And so what I want to share with you is some of our findings based on the work with our member countries in terms of what the opportunities, also some of the challenges we're seeing when it comes to incorporating NBS and food systems into NDCs. So basically, if we actually, the partnership has been around for 7 years. We now have 105 developing country members. And when we look at the requests that we get from countries, because basically we are country driven, it means that countries bring requests to us and we mobilize the expertise of our members to support those requests. We find that close to just under 50% of the countries that have put requests to the partnership are actually including requests on nature-based solutions. And what we find is that from those requests, a third have come in the process of NDC updates and 2/3 related to NDC implementation. So the first starting point is that while we have a lot of work to do, based on our experience with countries across all regions of the world, the demand for nature-based solutions is there, is real. Countries are seeing it and they are requesting support. So that gives us an important entry point. The second piece I wanted to highlight is that while this is the case, because there are requests, it shows that there is a need, and there is a need that is unmet. And what is it that we're noticing in terms of the challenges when it comes to incorporating nature-based solutions into the NDCs? The first thing, which has been echoed by some of the other speakers today, is a need to support an understanding of what nature-based solutions are, and the options of how then they can be incorporated into action in the country. Sometimes we see a request for nature-based solutions related support, but the request itself shows that there is a need to support unpacking that further so that further requests for technical assistance can be clear and we can go deeper into the opportunities. So in that, the development of tools, supporting countries to access country-specific data based on their context, based on the political economy of the country, and actual solutions that are tailored to the realities of the countries is really important. So, for example, we have seen in one of our member countries, Niger, where actually UNDP came in to unpack what are the linkages between climate and food security? And what does that mean in terms of the actions that Niger could take? And UNCDF, another partnership member institution, then came in to unpack how to tackle specific climate hazards related in the agricultural sector. So that kind of like going deeper into what countries can really do is something that we see a need for. The second piece, which was alluded as well, and it really resonates with what we've seen in the partnership, is that when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're talking about what Manuel was saying at the beginning, connecting, right? Yet the reality is that most of the work is highly fragmented and siloed. We're talking about connecting when in fact the design of NDCs and sectoral plans do not necessarily bring these pieces together. So one of the areas in which the partnership has provided consistent support over the years has been in helping to put in place institutional arrangements that can facilitate a whole of government and then whole of society planning for the NDCs, and then can support coordinated implementation with embedded capacity to coordinate, but also embedded capacity for people who can really help think and make those connections so that we come out of the different corners and really look at what can be done. And the final piece is finance. The number one request that we're getting through the partnership is requests for mobilization of financial support. And in that, there is a need, of course, for support. We're getting requests for the development of projects and concepts. But one of the areas that is really clear is that there needs to be a more comprehensive investment planning that is looking at innovative financial mechanisms, bringing in particularly for nature-based solutions, going beyond the public finance into private sector finance. So there is a lot that needs to be brought into place so that countries can have the confidence that they can do more, which brings me to the last point, which is related to the next round of NDC updates. The partnership supported member countries in the last round of NDC updates. We supported almost 70 countries in updating their NDCs. And now we already have a call open so that countries can bring requests to develop their long-term strategies and develop their NDCs. And in there, what we are seeing is most definitely an appetite to bring nature-based solutions into the equation. And therefore, this is the time to give them confidence that this can be done. So between now and 2025, we think that with expertise from a lot of institutions, including WWF and others, I think countries can be in a better condition to put targets that they have more confidence on.
Please think of questions. I'm going to ask one question follow-up to this panel, linking that side of the panels, some of the insights, but then please, I will take one or two questions before we close it out. So please think about what you may like to ask all the panelists up here. So my question is follow-up, and I'm going to just have it free form for all of you. As you mentioned, I'm going to just pull on a statistic. You mentioned a third of countries requesting MBS support is around NDC updates, and 2/3 are around NDC implementation. I guess the question I wanted to know, given that a lot of the elephant in the room we talked about is political economy, political will, shifting and aligning incentives, why and what was it that drew countries to want to change the plan in Colombia and align? Start with the why, like what is motivating them? And I don't know, when you are asked online and you reach out or respond to an ad, they'll ask you, where did you hear this from? You know, was it from a friend? Where did you get it? Where and why are countries reaching out? Where did they hear it from? What's motivating them? What is their incentives and their reason of why they want to change all of this? Is it, so that's my first. And I think, hold on, and then you also mentioned, right, that countries need to do work differently, facilitation of a whole of country approach. That seems like something we can help once there's an incentive or desire that you can help a country figure out how to do. Not easy, but that's a how, right? And then you mentioned, everyone has mentioned finance and incentives. And so there's a lot for donors in the room, public and private, to think about getting behind an approach that's more integrated, whole of government. But you start with the why and what's the ambition, what are the outcomes that country's trying to achieve. So what and how, in your minds and the experience you have working with different country governments or partners, is motivating them, and how to tease that out?
I think, yes? I think the why is challenging. I think the why for at least Colombia is the vulnerability, but also to be able to really quantify the contribution to implement nature-based solutions into that is less costly. It can be even an additionality for the economic values for business. And it will be less costly and or maybe promote the reduction of the social indicators and the inequalities that we have in the country. And the understanding that we cannot meet the 51% of the NDCs without integrating nature-based solutions into the equation. I think it's a clear why. The how, I don't think that is so clear at the moment, because sometimes we put the chapeau of nature-based solutions for a lot of things that they are not, as Mariana was pointing out, what is really nature-based solutions. But on the top of my head, I will say, like in the Amazon summit, and there is another why, they say we are reaching the tipping point. And the governments commit to really use international market instruments and financial instruments to avoid reaching the tipping points in the Amazon, to define what is bioeconomy for the region and what is nature-based solutions for the region, and not each country thinking or defining what is what, because otherwise we can really reach the tipping point or have kind of affecting one country to the other in the same region. So I think that is very important in the how, to really work together as one Amazon, define what are the nature-based solutions, what is a bioeconomy for the region, what type of policies, what type of financial instruments, and moving certain financial instruments in the international arena. And at the country level, I think the how is to convene again the other sectors. We cannot, as the environment sector, be the one to be kind of the powerful, because it's not. So they need to convene education for a culture. They need to convene health, the equity, the treasury, transport, for the whole traceability of the production chain and so on, agriculture. And I can say on and on in different ways. And part of the how at the moment in the country, we are using the momentum of updating the biodiversity action plan as the convener with the different type of sectors to really liaise the food systems in terms of producing better, restoring the land, the soil, but also in terms of reducing waste and healthy diets, to convene in terms of the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal agreement, to convene climate and to convene the way of producing. And so that, I think, is the how, using kind of the SKUs of the biodiversity agreement to convene others.
So if Sabrina or Mariana.
Sure, I'll just add a few more thoughts here. Similarly, in terms of the why, I think a big motivation is that we're already seeing negative impacts. We're already seeing, especially in the agriculture sector, how farmers are suffering from drought after drought after drought, and the impacts that has on even income, food security, et cetera. So the impact is there, and that's driving a lot of the urgency in terms of even the motivation for what to include in various policies. And then how, I would say that at least in the CGR, we're looking at how transformation can happen and really researching those questions, getting into the political economy and not really straying from those hard questions. But it does take more digging to understand, and especially in different contexts, how transformation can happen. And one of the things we're also looking at in terms of transformation is specifically transformative adaptation, which is another term that's being thrown around, but really we see it as a way for adaptation to address the root causes of vulnerability and to really put social equity at the forefront. Because what we've seen is that in previous solutions, many were technologically focused and not really considering the role of nature and people. And so we really want to emphasize approaches that put social equity at the fore, that put people at the forefront and are locally led. And we think if governments can get behind locally led adaptation solutions, they'll see that they're more context specific, more relevant for various communities' needs, and can also integrate other aspects of nature-based solutions and more so. So I think that's one area where we can really mobilize more support behind the role of locally led adaptation and transformation.
So I talked a bit about the how, so let me come back to your question about the why. So I think that, when we have been seeing progress on nature-based solutions, I would say the first countries that have come to the forefront have often been countries with high biodiversity, and therefore there has been nature-based solutions has been a way in which to show that it is possible to meet mitigation and adaptation objectives while delivering socioeconomic benefits, right? So I think that has been the tip of the spear. But what I would say, based on the experience of the partnership, is that I would say from those nature-based solutions related requests, like 70% of those are related to adaptation. So in a way, the driver right now is the vulnerability, right? Like, and nature being seen as, nature-based solutions being seen as a way to address this. Now, I think that part of our collective role is to be able to work with countries to unpack that, to see the multiple facets that this has, and that it most definitely can help address, so that we go beyond only technological solutions to look at questions of vulnerability, but then also how we can look at the other aspects that nature-based solutions brings, which brings us again back to the question of what is high quality nature-based solutions. So ultimately, that is what is driving the demand. But then in order to create enough political ownership and support for that demand, for those solutions, that's when we need to look at the issue of incentives. And that requires, of course, deeper work, not just on the technical biological side, but most definitely on the economic and the political economy side.
Wonderful. I just, the concepts of risk return, peace, security, and broad self-interest, obviously adaptation, transformative adaptation were our thoughts. Okay, let me just take two quick questions, or just quick, and then we'll do 3 minutes of letting people answer. And then I really want to make sure we have time for the fireside chat.
Hi, Sabrina, you spoke about conflict-sensitive approaches. Oh, yes, sorry. Hi, I'm Marcela Maldonado. I work for the Nature Conservancy, bringing innovation methodologies into conservation. Sabrina, you spoke about conflict-sensitive approaches, and I am wondering how the social and political conflicts brought on by the impact of COVID is impacting how nature-based solutions or national NDCs, sorry, I'm a little nervous, are crafted around agriculture. But this is a question for everyone, obviously.
This is, first of all, I want to say thank you to all the panelists for a really engaging and interesting panel. My name is Ezekiel. I'm a recent graduate of the Columbia Climate School. This is a question for everybody, but partially for James. You mentioned sort of the stranded asset issue and the people who are very invested in sort of business as usual within the agricultural sector. Could you talk maybe about some of the low-hanging fruit that could be done to get around those entrenched interests before we really tackle those stranded asset issues?
Yeah, so I would say that with COVID and really the impact that we're seeing, I'll just focus on the arid and semi-arid lands in Kenya, because we've been working with partners to pretty much understand what does climate security really mean in that context. How are the different communities in arid and semi-arid lands currently dealing with conflict around natural resources? What are the effects of climate? Will they exacerbate those conflicts in any way? And what can be done to really mitigate that effect? We're not seeing as much links with COVID at this point, but really more so on the climate extremes. And I would just say that it's been important to really engage with the community to understand from their perspective, how would they answer these questions versus, dropping in solutions from the sky. It really has to be something from the ground up in order to make sure that it's valid and sustainable in the long run. So those are some of the things that we're working on in terms of the links between climate and conflict in that context.
Thanks. So I'm not sure there are many low-hanging fruit. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I think people talk about low-hanging fruit, like food loss and waste was a low-hanging fruit, but food loss and waste is just getting worse, right? So I think low-hanging fruit is is something we've been trying to deal with for a long time, and I think it's a bit of a misnomer. But I get your point. I think the food system right now is running in a certain way, and in its way, it's quite resilient, right? So it took a hit with the Ukraine crisis, but it's kind of managed to kind of even itself out. The trouble is, it's the fact that a lot of the grain doesn't go to human consumption, for example, it goes elsewhere. So I think one of the ways is building the case, if you like, for change. So some really good examples are grassroots activities that are really coming up again around regenerative practices, restorative practices. And then, because it's not always governments that make the right decisions, sorry to say, it's also they have to respond to what's happening on the ground. So I think it's a mixture. I think it's about advocacy on one hand, making sure that the policy coherences are correct, but also encouraging these really good grassroots efforts that are saying, actually, you know what, we don't want to produce commodities, we want to produce food, and that we want to farm in a way that's good for ourselves, our family, and the environment. Thanks.
A big round of applause for our whole panel. We got into a lot of depth, and thank you so much, everyone. And let me turn it over to Manuel for our closing session.
Good, thank you, Melissa, and thank you for a great panel. So we will wrap up in an active way, so with a fireside chat with 3 invitees. First one, Pablo Vieira from the NDC Partnership. Please, Pablo. Then Kaveh Zahedi from FAO. Any place. And there is a third invitee that probably you can't see. It's the elephant. So let's keep. It's always there is an elephant in the room. So the idea is to keep this elephant in the room, because that could be the way to really promote an active participation. And I'm not sure if you have ever wondered where things are happening here in New York during this climate week. More close to the UN headquarters, that way, no? I don't know. Or more close to the Hudson. No? Because it is interesting. Tomorrow we will have the climate summit, and nobody's talking too much about the climate summit. So the point is things are happening and change, it is possible because those political decisions, or it is, as James mentioned, it is related to the political economy. Because let me start with you, Pablo. If we were to stock the state of the world, what can we say? We are in a time of non-functional systems. The planetary system is not working well in sense we are affecting it. The political system, it's on high risk with weak democracies. The economic and financial system are as well, no? Not promoting more equity and equality. It is still promoting more fragmentation and big gaps. And yesterday, Pablo, I heard NDCs won't change things. The NDCs are the political side, but it is not through NDCs that we will promote that systemic change that we are looking for. What do you think about that phrase? It is true?
I think, thank you, Manuel. I think it's a very dangerous phrase because I think we're hearing a lot of that, but mostly from those who have the appetite to launch a new thing, to create another thing, which is only diluting the limited resources, increasing the burden on developing countries that have to now navigate all these plans, all these commitments, all these frameworks, all these UN conventions. The thing is, and of course, Manuel, you were a very important part of this, the process that led to Paris was unlocked at one point because of the NDCs. Because we moved from a top-down approach where, yeah, we use science and we assign responsibilities to, well, countries are in the driver's seat and they decide what to commit to, ideally using that science and their historical responsibilities and their capacities. But that was the moment where things shifted and where the Paris Agreement was possible, because we were giving the countries the value and the respect that they deserve in terms of it. You are in the driver's seat. It is your responsibility to do this. We added, of course, the cycle so that we increase ambition, which was a great idea because it allows us to get to the Paris Agreement as fast as possible. We've only gone through one, so we shouldn't be giving up on that, even though we're still not there. So it's incredibly important for us to hold on to the spirit of the Paris Agreement in terms of this is a universal agreement. It brings all the countries together, not like Kyoto that was about a few of them. This is about mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation. So we have all the tools in place. No, it's not just about energy or about mitigation. It's about everything. And that allows us to link it to the only thing that I believe will be able to allow us to move forward, which is to sustainable development, to economic growth, even to countries solving their economic and social issues. So we actually have to double down on the importance of the NDCs in the next few years. And we need to make sure that we are doing it in a way that is really linking the different conversations and the different processes. And of course, that we discussed it very much. A few words that I've heard in so many conversations, depending on where we talk to, the whole of government, whole of society approaches, the enabling environments and linking the different agendas, the ownership, leadership of the sectors, the transformation action, the alignment, the need for finance, the collective efforts. Those are all common principles if you talk about nature, if you talk about desertification, if you talk about climate, if you talk about sustainable development. So we have a huge opportunity to drive all of that through the one tool, the NDCs, that actually have some level of accountability at the country level, because everything else is voluntary. So we need to use that. And though we have a great opportunity to do it there, so hopefully we will double down, we will bring all the agendas together, and we will drive forward based on the spirit of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, and you know, Pablo, that deeply in my heart, I believe on that. But it is my role today to challenge you. So when the NDC, and before of you, Kaveh, let me replicate to Pablo. When we developed the NDC concept, it was to create confidence, no? After Copenhagen, moving to Paris, no? As an idea to have all together in the same table, saying something, putting targets and pledges. But do we think that currently NDCs are system change lever instruments or are just reactive? And because remember that we are talking about global stocktake and we are talking about MBS. So how, by bringing MBS and nature because of the global or through the global stocktake towards a better NDC cycle, we can promote to have those instruments as real strong lever for system change?
I think that's a critical element. And again, we're starting the second round of NDCs, but if you read the first report from the Global Stocktake, it has one positive thing, which is the Paris Agreement has really made a difference in terms of making sure that climate is front and center everywhere and with every kind of stakeholder. And a big part of that was the NDCs. No, so there's huge challenges to be able to move that forward. And one of the biggest one is to link this agenda with the other agenda so that we don't have to think in parallel about all the things that we need to do, but we use a common framework of sustainable development to move it forward. And the only way to achieve that is to really demonstrate that strong climate action, strong nature action is going to bring those social and economic benefits that we're talking about as the co-benefits when they're really the benefits, while the other things are the co-benefits. And nature-based solutions are critical in that because they actually are proven in terms of bringing mitigation, bringing adaptation, well-being, social, economic benefits and gains. So that is a critical element that countries can use to find ambition very easily and to be able to mobilize finance easily, even from the private sector, easier than other things. It's cheaper solutions than energy and other sectors. And you can see very quickly the gains and the benefits in terms of society, economy, and development. So I think that's why we need to make sure that nature-based solutions have a stronger role in the next round of NDCs. It will allow countries to raise ambition, but also it will allow them to implement faster and see those benefits. And then ideally, we don't need the Paris Agreement because climate action is embedded in the regular cycles of development in countries. We don't need to force them to do it every 5 years, but they do it automatically when they see those benefits. But that will take time and it will take transformational action, of course. But I think that nature-based solutions can be a critical element to unlock that potential in terms of the NDCs.
Thank you, Pablo. So I will go back to the guy who made that statement to be clear that it has to change. So Kaveh, food has gotten a strong political traction in the, for sure, biodiversity, nature, and in the climate agenda. Probably also because of the summit some months ago, a year ago, a bit more or less, I don't remember. But what are you or how FAO is working in making an economic case for food to have it or to have it, yeah, to have more a strong role in achieving our climate and nature objectives?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a hard question to answer, but let me try to answer it in this way. I mean, what you just said about nature-based solution, if you replace nature-based solutions with agri-food solutions, you could say exactly the same thing, right? So agri-food solutions hold the key to addressing biodiversity, to addressing climate. And I sense that although we've begun to move in that direction, right? I mean, in the climate process, you have built into it now what used to be the Coronivia process, now the Sharm el-Sheikh's joint work. It talks about food and food security, agriculture and food security within the climate context. Under the Biodiversity Convention with the Global Biodiversity Framework, about half of those targets can be linked back to food systems, not just target 10. So I think we're beginning to sort of resonate, but the conversation is the starting point of the conversation, and I think we heard it again here, is always that Food systems, you know, are responsible for somebody called the culprit for, you know, 30% of GHG emissions, and it's entirely the wrong approach. And I think it's because of that approach that the NDCs in particular, although 95% of them mention food and agriculture and land, they don't integrate the solutions and therefore enable those same solutions to help them raise their ambitions in the NDCs. It's like in passing mention, these are also important, but not at the level of ambition that they could if they had the regenerative agriculture completely built in, the food loss and waste completely built in, the soil regeneration completely built in, right? So I sense it's about turning it a little bit on its head and looking more from a solutions perspective. How much of a solution does this agri-food system transformation bring? And that's what the Global Stocktake in essence said, right? It said basically, we're not doing very well on mitigation, we're not doing very well on adaptation, not doing very well on means of implementation, and you know, and frankly, the loss and damage is still a bit fuzzy as well. We need system change, and it mentioned where that system change is, and if agri-food systems are one of those that needs to be changed, and James rightly said, it's a super complicated one to change. We've got to start, I think, unpacking and looking under the bonnet beyond nature-based solutions, which we're talking about in this forum, beyond the regenerative agriculture, without the climate smart agriculture. You know, we've got to sort of look under the bonnet and see what exactly does that mean? What are the solutions we offer and how much can they contribute to the sustainable use of biodiversity, to mitigation, to adaptation?
And Kaveh, guide us by putting like 2 or 3 good examples on how to enable that conditions to bring solutions as a way to enhance NDCs.
Well, so it's already happening. The NDC partnership is really important. And we have initiatives where we're partnering with UNDP and others, the Scala, working with countries to, as I say, integrate these solutions much better into the NDCs, because all of us are calling for raising ambition. But you know, how do you instill the confidence that you can raise ambition for a country, right? How can it commit itself to raising its ambition? And you have to demonstrate how a different approach to food, a different approach to agriculture can actually very easily help them address that ambition. But we can't do it by ignoring the food security conversation, right? I mean, many people said today it's about climate, biodiversity, and food security. The food security piece is a little bit wobbly here. I mean, you saw just a few weeks ago, the latest report that we did, over 700 million people are still living in hunger. You know, if that was a country, someone said this morning, it would be the 3rd biggest country in the world. Right, so that has to, the food security element has to be front and center. But as we saw in the last IPCC report, it's not an exclusive trade-off conversation. You can have mitigation and adaptation and sequestration and food security, right, in some of the interventions. And it's those interventions that we have to, in a way, highlight and sell better. And to answer your question, that's exactly what we're hoping to do. We're systematically looking across these solutions in terms of a roadmap to achieving 1.5 degrees and SDG 2, detailing what are exactly the solution packages, how much they contribute to the different agendas, biodiversity, climate, mitigation, adaptation, and of course, food security. And we're going to release that by COP. And hopefully that gives us another sort of entry point, right? For countries to say, okay, now let me design something like that, but in my national context.
Yeah. And based on that, Pablo, on what Kaveh has just said, the NDC partnership as a good tool to enable that conditions. How do you expect this process on NBS, the political one, could be part of the NDC partnership to support countries with technical assistance to enable their conditions to create ownership? Because I am all the time thinking that sometimes we are used to thinking that by developing something in the global arena, it is enough to create domestic ownership. That is not true. We can see that has happened historically with the carbon markets. A lot of resistance, a lot of opposition. So how can we avoid that with MBS by enabling those conditions domestically to build that ownership, and what role NDC could play? And that is a question for the two.
Thank you, Manuel. And I think that's very important because if we go back to the first round of NDCs, we know that countries were doing this mostly out of political pressure and to try to bring something to the table to Paris. but they didn't have the time, the resources, the knowledge to do it right. And I think that what changed in the second round of NDCs, and a lot of the support that we provided was focused on that, was countries went through a right process and they went through the quality part of it. And it's exactly the point. If you have the right data, the right information, the right tools, the right modeling, if you have the ownership from the different stakeholders across the government and across society, if you have the Ministry of Agriculture setting the goals for food systems, and the Ministry of Energy for energy instead of the Ministry of Environment setting them for all of them, things change radically. No, NDCs become high quality. They become owned by everyone. They may become implementable, which is fundamental. And I think that's a critical element for the next 2.5 years or so before the next round of NDCs. And that's where we need for all the members of the NDC partnership to bring their expertise, their knowledge to help countries find what the best practices out there translate in terms of their own context and their own reality so that they can include that as part of the quality of their NDCs. And what we saw last time was that putting for a second ambition aside, if you focus on the quality and the process, that unlocks ambition. And ambition that makes sense, that is implementable, and it's not just a top line ambition like the first round of NDCs. And that's where FAO and WWF and UNDP and UNEP, all as members of the partnership, have the right expertise and the contacts at the country level with the right stakeholders to help the Ministry of Environment, who's leading in many cases the process, to bring the quality into the NDC so that they can be more ambitious, but at the same time, they create that ownership and that quality.
And also the same question for you, but do we still need to have a Minister of the Environment? I used to be, and I don't
Me
think.
too, so.
Okay, Kaveh.
That's my question.
No. Also, you can address it.
No, look, I sense that with all of these instruments, whether it's the NDCs, the NBSAPs, the food system pathways, to some degree, the new generation of VNRs, they all have to evolve into being almost like the investment plans of a country, right? What is the set of solutions that this country wants to invest in to deal with biodiversity, climate, and food security? And I think that brings us to the money question that we haven't talked about enough, because certainly from a food systems perspective, if you look at where climate finance is going, right, in terms of the broader climate finance that the World Bank looks at, private, public, everything, less than 3% is going to agri-food system solutions. So we've got this whole breadth of solutions, many of which are captured in NDCs, but there's no investment in them, right? And that's a problem. Even if you look at development finance, the famous, OECD DAC monitored climate development finance, it's about 18% of that that's going towards agri-food system solutions, many of which we talked about, the soil regeneration, et cetera, and that amount is declining. So at the same time that we are sort of unpacking these solutions that exist and embedding them in NDCs and embedding them in NBSAPs and embedding them in the food system pathways, the money is flowing somewhere else. And I think that's a big problem. That's a big problem, because then we're going to forever go on and say agri-food systems contribute 30% because we're not investing in the potential they have of mitigation, in the potential they have of building resilience and beyond.
Yeah, fully agree. And that is why I mentioned that we have to keep the elephant that James brought to the room in this discussion, because I think it was yesterday, I was talking about that great role that WRI played when they created this Global Commission for Climate and the Economy. I think that was the name. And it was fantastic because helped the process to be well organized, to define sectors that supported and helped the transitions and all of that. And now it has been finished, naturally finished. But I am thinking why we shouldn't recover the idea of a commission on climate and the economy to think on how can we transition into a strong global climate economy, because we are not just on that time. We are walking towards a climate economy, but we haven't developed the full conditions to think about a climate economy in the world, but probably that could happen in 10, 12 years. So what can we do? What can we do with the NDCs to put more closer the NDCs to the Minister of Finance? Because that is key. No, it is not an issue of Minister of the Environment. It is probably more important to have Minister of Finance discussing, adopting, making that the economic case for development. What can we do?
Yep, I think that's one of the hardest things. And I think I'll go back to what you said. I think NDCs need to be followed by an implementation plan and by investment plan associated to
And
it.
that is not happening.
And that is not happening in most cases. And if you think of an investment plan, well, the first person who should be there is the Ministry of Finance, because the national budget needs to be one of the biggest contributors to all climate action and nature action. So in that sense, that is the logical process. The thing is, of course, we go back to the Ministries of Environment, and Ministries of Environment don't know how to develop a project or an investment plan or a finance strategy. No, so they need to go to someone to help them. And that is not happening because there's not the ownership at the side of the Ministries of Finance, and there's limited support available for things like that. So we're doing a lot of work on that, trying to push that forward. But there's also a reality here, which is Ministries of Environment, as you said it at the beginning, have very little resources available. And even though a lot of this is not their responsibility and they shouldn't be implementing it, they a lot of times also block the way for others to come in at the country level because they think that they're going to lose their limited resources. So much of the budget of a Ministry of Environment is international cooperation, that if they open the door for other sectors, they might just take all of it. So it is very difficult, the dynamic in the country. So I think we do need something like a new climate economy 2.0. But the thing is, I think it disappeared by natural means because it was obvious that the theory was there, but implementing it at the country level required a special effort because you cannot have just global guidance on this. You have to land it at the country level, at each country. And I think a few countries went through that process and it was really interesting, but we need the capacity to bring Ministers of Finance, Ministers of Planning to lead these exercises and say like, I'll take the NDCs, I'll take the MBSAPs, I'll take the NAPs, and I'll bring it into my development planning process, my budgeting processes. I'll assign the responsibilities to the different sectors. And that only happens if you have ownership at the highest level.
Yeah.
If you don't have the president, the head of state, giving the order to the ministers to do it, it will never happen.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's how do you land this? And we do have some means of doing sort of triggering that change. Looking at it a little sort of selfishly from the food system perspective, one great tool I think that we have at our disposal comes from the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, that is now adopting this more integrated program approach, right? The integrated program on food systems gives us exactly the tool to help land at least one part of the solutions at the country level. It's only, $220 million or so. It'll involve about 30 countries, but it gives us the opportunity to pick out the solutions that are in the NDCs, they're in the MBSAPs, they're in the food system pathways, and bring them together in a sort of investment plan, in a transformation plan at the country level. So it's not, of course, it's not the only one. That's one of the ones that FAO is leading with IFAD. But I think these are going to be the critical sort of instruments to trigger the landing that is so necessary.